So hi everyone, and welcome to my presentation. I changed the name of it, so now it is Accommodating Restorative Justice Practices to Meet the Unique Needs of the Autistic Community. So hello, I'm Kelly Bron Johnson, one of your classmates. So if you didn't see my intro video at the beginning of the session, here I am now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about language and take you through a lot of just basic concepts about autism and stuff before I talk about how it applies to restorative justice. So I use the words disability, I use the words autistic. For me, disability is not a bad word. It can make people uncomfortable. Often people try to they don't want to use it. They'll use euphemisms like, different ability and those kind of things, or special needs. I do not use those terms at all. So I use the terms autistic and disabled to speak of myself. And 97% of autistic people prefer identity first language. So that's saying we prefer saying we are autistic rather than saying that we are someone with autism. I also bring up a little bit about neurodiversity. And so said, what the heck is that? It's kind of a newer term, and it's an umbrella term. So neurodiversity is a concept that all brains are different and important and valid. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It goes with the social model of disability, which means that it's the environment and the outside social community that creates barriers for people with disabilities. And so it's not the disability itself that's disabling, it's actually the environment that we're in and the society that we're in that creates these barriers. So neurodiversity is the concept that there's nothing wrong inherently with the brain, it's just different. And so, like I said, it's an umbrella term, so it includes not just autism, it includes ADHD, all mental health conditions. So that also includes schizophrenia. Again, sometimes people get uncomfortable with that, but it's the whole umbrella term of neurodiversity. It includes learning disabilities, intellectual disability, traumatic brain injuries, fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and all of those are part of different types of brains. And one big concept that we use in the disability community is the concept of presumed competence. And so this means that always assume that whether or not the person can speak or not, this is not a reflection of somebody's level of intellectual ability or their comprehension ability. We should always work with the assumption that that anyone can learn anything, and that you can't tell by somebody's outward movements, appearance, or speech abilities as to how competent they are at achieving certain goals or doing certain things. So even though I am focusing on autism for this particular presentation, there are a lot of overlaps. There are a lot of what we call comorbidities with autism. So this kind of work is bigger than just autism. There are a high percentage of people with dyslexia in the prison population as well. So it's not just about autistic people in the prison population. There are a lot of undiagnosed people with learning disabilities. There's many, many different things. And so that's part of what this whole work is doing. I don't want to reduce it to just autism, even though that's what I'm focusing on. But it's a problem that is systemic in general. But again, it's about presuming competence, and that autistic people or otherwise neurodivergent people are capable of going through a restorative justice process. And there just might need to be some accommodations. But the idea is that we should assume that anybody who would like to participate in a restorative justice process should be permitted that opportunity and given the supports to be able to do that. So what is autism? starting from the beginning, it is a neurodevelopmental disorder that primarily affects social communication and sensory processing. So neurodevelopmental just means that we develop on a different timeline. That's why it's a disorder. It does not mean that we will never develop. It does not mean that it's not possible. It doesn't mean that there's limits. It just means we develop differently. And it primarily affects social communication and sensory issues. So social communication, we like to say that we have our own communication and we have our own language. And I'd say the autistic community has our own culture. We understand each other when we communicate with each other, and there's wonderful studies on this. We understand each other when we're speaking with other autistic people, and there is a disconnect a lot of the times when we're speaking with neurotypical people. So neurotypical people are anybody who is neurotypical, not autistic or not otherwise neurodivergent. And so the issues in miscommunication comes from us not understanding each other, not that either of our communications systems are wrong, just that they are different and we're not understanding each other. And so this is kind of important because a major issue that we're going to see later about why a lot of autistic people end up in prison is because of these miscommunications and because of these differences in movement and interpretation of our actions, of our behaviors, of our communication. And there's nothing inherently criminal about being autistic. It's about, unfortunately, a lot of times it's only because we're misunderstood. So there are also studies that show that the way that we move, our gait, the way that we walk is different. So we're visibly different, even though people say autism is an invisible disability. We don't have facial features. We don't have any of the sort of marking to say this is who we are. But many times if one of us, if we're walking down the street, if somebody is flapping or they're walking kind of differently, or they're talking to themselves, or they're wearing ear defenders, we stick out like sore thumbs, and we become targets for police questioning. And then we don't answer those questions properly because we have the social communication disorder, and this leads to problems. I also want to note that if you look in the DSM-5, the way that autism is described, and many other neurodevelopmental disorders as well, the way they're described is by the outside appearance of what a clinician sees when they see us. And it's not very much about what we feel and how we experience the world. And so that's also an interesting to kind of take into account. But what I wanted to also say was there's nothing in the DSM-5 that includes a lack of empathy, any sort of more, we're not more violent, a propensity for violence. That's what I want to say. There's nothing about our intellectual abilities being different. In fact, we've got about a 2% difference with the general population in terms of intellectual ability. So we're not that far off. And it's not a mental health issue either, even though many of us do suffer from mental health issues a lot of the times because of the way we've been treated in society, and that we're actually more likely to be bullied. So statistically, we're actually more likely to experience violence and crimes against us than we are to commit crimes. But this stigma kind of stays with us, that we have a lack of empathy, and then therefore we would not be able to engage in a restorative justice process in a meaningful way. Unfortunately, that was started by a Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen, who decided that we didn't have empathy through one kind of theory that he came up with. But that's not the case. We have other studies now that show that there's actually a double empathy problem, where neurotypical people are actually lacking in empathy towards autistic people and the way that we behave. So I wanted to also kind of clarify the kind of community that I'm talking about, because these are solutions I'm making for our community. And so when I'm talking about the community. I put the hashtag for actually autistic, so I'm talking about autistic adults. It's a fantastic hashtag if you are interested in following on Twitter or Facebook. If you follow the actually autistic hashtag, you'll find a lot of self-advocates who are there answering people's questions, and you'll gain a lot of insight into the community if you're curious. For us, we accept anybody who's formally diagnosed or not, because we know that the barriers to diagnosis are so onerous. There are class issues, just speaking in Canada where I am, it's extremely expensive to try and get a diagnosis, more in the thousands of dollars, and it's not part of our public health system. There are issues with race, where we know that the research has been primarily done on white boys and men. And unfortunately, that means that we miss a lot of people who are non-white. And then there's cultural issues as well. And there's gender issues. Again, with all the studies and research, it's primarily been done on men or males, and women are often missed for diagnosis. So there's a lot of issues around that. So we accept self-diagnosis into our community. So why is this important? Why am I focusing on autistic people for restorative justice? So in the US, autistic people make up 4.4% of the prison population right now, which is at a rate of prevalence of 4 times higher than the general population, which is scary to me. It's absolutely scary. And the numbers are actually similar in the UK, and the numbers are also similar for dyslexic people. Autistic people specifically are typically serving sentences for social differences or misunderstandings, public meltdowns, homelessness, and drug addiction. Again, there are many studies as to why many people will self-medicate with drugs, specifically autistic people and those with ADHD as well. But a lot of the stories that I've read of crimes that are committed are because an autistic person said something or didn't say something at the wrong time. And you say, well, why would they be arrested for that? And many times it's simply because for example, there's one other case where, or actually there's more than one, but where an autistic man was standing outside a library waiting, and then the police came and questioned him. He was Black as well, so that is part of the issue when there's racial profiling. And anyway, he got questioned for standing outside a library, and he didn't answer. He kind of shut down. He didn't communicate, and so he turned away from the police officer and tried to get away, which ended up in a scuffle, and he ended up getting arrested for that. And then there's other times when things will escalate because of a public meltdown of some sort. And again, I just kind of want to be clear about what a meltdown is. It's usually when there's a sensory overload of some sort. It can look very violent. There can be yelling. It can look very aggressive. However, it's important to note that meltdowns are actually violence directed inwards towards the self. So you might see somebody hitting themselves in the head, biting themselves. And then if you try to restrain them, if you try to talk to them, you try to calm them down, it escalates, and they might, kind of blindly punch out and things like that. But it's more of an escape. They're trying to get away. But again, we can't have these kind of things in public. But sometimes autistic people might get arrested for what look like violent outbursts, but they're not necessarily meant that they're hurting somebody. And again, homelessness is a social issue, which is quite prevalent with anybody in the disability community. So I asked you to read this case of Darius McCullum. And there's actually also a movie out about him that was released in 2016, which I haven't gotten to watch, but there's more coverage. And so I read the case of Darius, and I was absolutely heartbroken because here's a man who is intelligent. He is not dangerous. He's never actually hurt anyone. Passengers, said that he was very helpful and friendly. And if you've ever been to New York City and you've taken the subway there, and you've ever asked any of the employees for help or advice or directions, you may know from experience that they're not always the most helpful and friendly people that we've ever encountered. Even though I love New Yorkers, I think they're fantastic people, but they're not always the most helpful when you're lost and taking the subway. But that said, Darius to me is a tragic case of wasted ability, wasted talent, where, yes, he did steal trains, he did steal buses, absolutely. But as somebody also said, or as has, part of the evidence that was put in court is he announced all the stops. He made all the correct stops. He knew all those lines by heart. He was on time. He was a good driver. So it's just balancing about, what caused the more harm. And, I just felt like things could have gone very differently had people dealt with him very differently. I also read in another article that he also worked with the MTA's union and fought for rights of employees, even though he wasn't an employee. So he was extremely well integrated into the MTA, despite not being employed, despite never getting paid. It was obviously his passion. And I read this and I just thought there had to be a better way. So by the way, also, if you want to know, he is still held in a psychiatric institution. People are still lobbying to try to get him out, but they're not successful at the moment. He has voluntarily committed himself to this institution because he feels that he cannot stop himself from going and being obsessed with trains. So I read all that and I said, there's got to be a better way to deal with cases like this. And so I want to acknowledge, I don't want to kind of invalidate or downplay the fact that, yes, there could have been harm. Had he taken a train and he crashed it, like that would have been hundreds of lives, that would have been hurt. So, I mean, yes, there was a potential for harm, absolutely. And obviously people should not have access, that much access to be able to kind of freely get on trains and buses and do as they wish. So yes, I acknowledge this, but I also feel that, again, that this could have been handled in a different way, and that maybe having him institutionalized when it's possible that he could be a productive member of society and free. I would rather see that than to see this talent wasted, his intelligence wasted, and to see resources spent on keeping him in an institution where he's actually held with very violent criminals, and he's not. So my vision with all of this is that autistic people who are convicted of nonviolent crimes would be able to bypass the criminal justice system completely and go straight to a restorative justice process. And I believe there's many benefits to this. There's problems with this vision, in the sense that we know that, again, that I said, diagnosis is a barrier, diagnosis is an issue. And so we can't assume that everybody who is going to be convicted of something will be able to come in hand with a autism diagnosis. And again, autism is not an excuse for certain behavior. It is still important that people learn the harm that they are causing and understand that. And I just believe that a restorative process would be more conducive to them learning what that harm is. And again, because I said, like at the beginning, autism is a developmental disability. So it doesn't mean never. It just means that we need to be explicitly taught certain things, and that includes aspects of the law. And it's very difficult to plan for every possible thing that can happen, but I think it's important that we're very explicit when teaching autistic people about laws, about behaviors. And unfortunately, that's something that's been lacking. But again, there's also the idea that people would have to disclose their diagnosis in order to see, what benefit that would be. And there's privacy issues. There's many issues. So my vision is not perfect. But in a utopic world, one day, I would prefer to see autistic people using, not being punished by the criminal justice system and using some sort of restorative process, especially if they haven't committed a violent crime. So I decided to adapt and make accessible restorative justice conferences. So why and how do we do this? So the whys, I think, are probably the most important, and we can bring a lot of healing, I think, to not just the autistic community, but the outside community as well. So basically, I said, using these principles of inclusion and voluntariness, which are, two restorative justice principles, because everyone who wants an opportunity at restoration should have that choice. So if they voluntarily want that, and they should be included. If that's what they want, I really feel that should be an option for everyone. I'm quoting, and I just realized I put professional Lyubansky instead of professor, but from one of the first handouts from our professor was because it helps develop capacity for empathy and social emotional learning. So even if we're just using that myth that autistic people are lacking empathy, which is not the case, but we do need some help with social emotional communication and learning. And we know that it can help develop capacity not just for autistic people, but for the whole greater community. I think we even saw from just talking about feelings and needs in the class that it was tricky for many people. So if it's good for one group, it's also good for the autistic community. And I believe that greater acceptance of autism will come from community involvement and ownership of conflict. So I do want to see the community involved in these processes so that they can help have a better understanding of autism and autistic people. And then maybe that will help for autistic people who are just walking down the street, maybe flapping, maybe talking to themselves, maybe hanging around outside a library waiting for it to open, and to be innocently left alone, or not, not arrested for just different ways of being. And so with all that, I adapted, I gave tips, I guess. So I ended up with 2 pages of tips of how to make the restorative justice process more comfortable and possible for everyone, which I'm not going to go through all here. I'll give that handout to you, and you can look at that and you can see, if you have questions about it. I'm also open to more ideas of what else we could add to it. But I'm hoping that you can use that as a foundation for working with different people and being open to having this process with different types of people, and different types of brains, and different types of personalities and diagnosis. And so I will give you that handout for you to keep and hopefully just use it in the future if you ever need it. So thank you. You can find me, of course, unfortunately, I'm Kelly Johnson 1. There must be another Kelly Johnson somewhere. So I'm number 1 at vermontlaw.edu. But of course, let's talk in the discussion. And if there's anything else that you want to talk about, you can always message me. Thank you.